Okay, hello everyone. Hi, my name is Mishaal, and I'm super excited to be here to be talking about a huge problem, which is food waste. So, just before I start, I just want to let you guys know that I am looking at the live right now as well. So, any questions you may have, just keep putting them in there, and I will periodically address them. And yeah, we can just get into it. But before we start, a little bit about me. So I'm Michelle, 17 years old, and for the past little bit, I've been really focused and interested into this problem of food waste. And I'll get to why it's such a huge, impactful, and kind of crazily stupid problem. Like, I can't believe it exists, but it's causing so many other issues and difficulties in our world. And on the side, I love solving different types of problems, from things like neonatal mortality to the water crisis. I love looking into and getting deep into these different types of problems and identifying root causes. I also love applying exponential technologies to solving these problems, because before we didn't really have these types of amazing toolkits to be able to apply and solve these problems. But right now, with things like the internet, anyone can really go deep into these problems, and anyone can learn and start to approach to solve this problem. So yeah, we can just get into it. When we think about problems in the world, we may think about things like poverty, inequality, hunger. These are all really big, name catchy problems. But what may not come to mind is something like food waste. I mean, food waste is just that extra bite of the sandwich that you leave uneaten. It's not really that big of a deal, or at least it's not really being talked about at all. But the thing is, huge problems like climate change, hunger, the wasting of all the resources that we have, or depletion of natural resources, can all be tied back to food waste. So, I'm not sure if you know about this, but we actually waste 40% of the food we produce, which is mind blowing. 40%, that's a pretty huge number. That means it's around 365 million pounds per day, which is insane. Because if you think about it, there are so many different problems, like we talked about, including hunger, poverty, all these people who are left without food to eat on their plate every single day. Like 1 in 8 Americans don't have food on their plate every day. And we're wasting so much food. What I really want from this presentation for you to take away is three main things. The first thing is having awareness of the problem. Because if you're not even aware of how big of a problem this is, it's really not likely that you'll be able to do anything about it. The second thing is really understanding the problem, understanding it at its root causes, because it right now, since we don't understand the problem and many people aren't doing anything to really reduce it, we're only applying band-aid solutions. The third thing is to empower change. Like I was saying, with giant, humongous, amazing resources like the internet, we really have the ability to learn about it through a live stream like this and start to brainstorm different ways that we can create change in the world. So, really, what I want to go through right now is three main things. The first being the effects of food waste. So, what are the real implications of this problem? We started looking into it right now, but what does this even mean? Like, how is this affecting people day to day? The second thing being, why is this even a problem in the first place? Really understanding the root causes to this crisis. And the third part being the solutions. What can you and I do about it? What can institutions do about it? What can governments do about it? So let's just get into the effects of food waste. Now, the food waste crisis is very much like an iceberg. At the top, we see, okay, there's this giant producer price of 75 billion. It's costing retailers a lot of money every single day. But what we don't see is that below the surface, there's so many things like deforestation, greenhouse gases emissions, increases in food prices, the impacts that it's really having on nature. And so there's really three tiers to the impact that food waste is actually having, the very negative causes and second order consequences of things like food waste. The first being the ecological impact. So we can break it down from ecological impact, which is if you're really concerned about the environment, that's great, that's for you. The second being societal impact. So people going hungry, all the societal problems that food waste is causing. And the third being economic impact. So maybe you aren't as passionate about like the problems like the environment or alleviating poverty or hunger in the world. Well, there is still so much money going into the food waste problem, and it's really just money being burned because it's not being put to use at all. So, this is the approximate land mass that we're using to produce food that doesn't even get eaten. Now, I think we all understand that the way that we produce our food currently, like all of the food that we're producing, the farming processes, the selling processes, retail, all of that, it's very environmentally consuming. One of the most common causes of greenhouse gas emissions, all of this is food waste or is the agricultural industry. And of this, food waste is a huge problem because the thing is that if we're putting in so many resources, so much of our environment, so much of our land, so much of our water into producing food, okay, well, we have to produce food anyways. So it's like, it's fine in a sense, or at least we need to work towards creating a solution, but it's not as big of a problem as the fact that not only are we wasting all these resources, all this water, all this land, all this labor, but we're also not even consuming that food in the first place. If food loss and waste were its own country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter, which is absolutely mind blowing to me. I don't know about you guys, but after China and the United States, food loss and waste causes the most greenhouse gas emissions. And then come other countries like India and Russia. There's also the societal impact. If you think about it, it's almost like a cycle where food loss and waste, okay, if it's being wasted, you also have to think about it this way that when food's being wasted, what's being done with it? Well, a lot of the time, there aren't really ways for people to repurpose food in their countries. So the food isn't being composted, it's not really being recycled and distributed to people who need it. Well, then it's being sent to the landfills and it's being burned. And when it's being burned, there's so many greenhouse gas emissions that are going to the atmosphere. So that's increasing climate change. The cycle I was talking about is that as climate change increases, people whose livelihoods depend on agriculture are being impacted. People whose lives are impacted by the really, really terrible effects, the bad weather effects, the land effects of climate change are now being even more impacted. And then the cycle continues. So as people continue to waste more food, then there's more pollution, there's more greenhouse gases, and it keeps going and going and going. So it's kind of mind blowing to me that if we just saved one fourth, not even the whole amount, just a fourth of the food that we waste globally, then we would have enough to feed 870 million hungry people on this planet. All those people could be fed by food that we're currently producing and that we're just wasting. It's just being thrown out. And so when we really think about it, people talk about solving the hunger crisis, solving poverty. And with poverty, it comes that if people don't have basic needs, then it's very hard for them to get out of the cycle. So if there's a food crisis, people don't have enough food, then you would think that there just isn't enough being produced. We just need to start producing more. But actually, if you understand the crisis like food waste, you know that you actually don't need to produce any more food. We're already doing way more than that. We just need to do something about all the food that we're wasting right now. And then there's also the economic impact. So we're spending $218 billion on wasted food every single year. And this comes with a lot of the resources like water and soil and land and fertilizer. That doesn't come cheap. With the economic incentive of saving all this, there's also the food loss and waste that happens at different levels. Like with consumers, if you didn't lose or waste so much food, you wouldn't need to buy so much food. You wouldn't need to spend so much money on food. With retailers, people who are selling it in shops, they wouldn't need to purchase more food from the farmers because then they wouldn't have as much waste and they would still be able to provide as much as they need in their grocery stores while having enough and not letting all this food go to waste. And for farmers, especially, they're spending their hard earned money, their hard earned hours tilling through fields, doing so much to grow proper crops. And when food is wasted or spoiled at that stage, it's just a lot of their hard earned labor coming into nothing, right? So, why is this even a problem then? And really, to understand this, it's super, super important to understand the root causes to this crisis. So, defining food loss is really important before we do that. Now, maybe we're thinking that, okay, food loss and waste in the scope or the understanding that I have of the world would be when I don't finish my sandwich or when I have that bag of oranges that go rotten and I have to throw them out. But it's really important to understand that there's a lot more to the problem than just at a consumer level. So if you look at it, the main causes of loss are spread throughout the supply chain. So this goes from farmer to fork. Everything that comes in between, there are causes of food loss and waste. With that, that means that even though it's so spread apart, it may seem like it's harder to put a solution into every single part of the process. But the thing is, that also enables us as consumers to be able to be a lot more proactive, a lot more aware of how much we're wasting, and be able to do something about it as well. It's not something like child slavery, where if you're not directly affected by the situation, you have a lot less that you're capable of doing. So food loss and waste happens throughout the whole supply chain, the whole time when your farmers are growing the food, to when they're packaging it, to when it's being sold to the retailers, to when the grocery stores are selling it to you, and then it comes to you. There's two different types of food loss then. The first is planned or unavoidable food loss. This is the thing that we probably won't be focusing on as much, which means it's things like your animal bones, like the husks, the peels of your foods, which you'd understand that to eat the food, we normally don't eat banana peels. So we would have to throw it out anyways. Then the second thing would be unplanned and avoidable food loss. So this is when there's so many different reasons for why it's thrown out, where it goes rotten, or there's a problem in the supply chain and the deliverers like have a bad process in place where a lot of their food spoils, or retailers aren't putting enough food in place, or they're putting too much food on display and it's causing more and more food to go unbought and then it rots. We're going to go into all the different types of unplanned food loss. There's also a need to understand that there's a difference between developed versus developing nations and food loss that's caused by there. With developed nations, the most amount of food loss waste happens towards the end of the value chain. So, this is when there's a lot of food in these developed countries. Customers are more picky, they're more rich, they can choose what they want to buy and they can choose what they want to waste. Because they have so much food in their fridge, it's okay if they throw up just a little bit or a couple bites or yesterday's leftovers. With developing nations, however, a lot of the problems happen at the start of the value chain. So this is when they don't have enough technology to store their food properly at the beginning of when the farmers have picked the food. They don't really have the infrastructure to be able to put it and store it well. They may also not have proper transportation methods. Not sure if you guys know this, but currently, when we're transporting our food in developed countries, we have lots of large trucks, like fleets of them, with refrigeration in place. They have to some foods have to be stored at a very specific temperature. So it's very thought out and planned. And when people don't even have things like fresh water in place, they're not going to have giant trucks available to have nice storage and cooling facilities, right? And then with developing nations, there's also a lot more extreme weather conditions as because of things like climate change and because of a lack of money in the society itself, it's harder for them to have things in place to prevent the effects of extreme weather conditions. And where the wasted food goes. Well, this is a general chart of where it goes. It's pretty different for developed and developing countries, but as a whole, um, around 56% of the food is just being thrown out or burned, which is worse. So in the landfill, the foods actually start to rot and release more greenhouse gases. And then when you incinerate the food, that's even worse because you're releasing a lot of carbon dioxide and methane, which again comes into the atmosphere, speeds up the process, keeps going. 44% of the food is recycled. Within this, there would also be things like composting or redistribution of food. But it really depends because some of the time when food's being composted or it's just being thrown out, it's not really being eaten. So that still doesn't count as recovered food loss. So now, great, we've identified the problem. We've identified that, yes, it has so many different, really harmful effects on so many different people. But how do we go about solving it? I could just start spitting solutions at you. Like, we could just do this, we could just do that. But all of those solutions would probably be very bad because we're not really identifying the root causes of the problem. Suppose, so root causes is like this. Suppose I'm running on the street and I fall and trip. I start bleeding. And if I didn't identify the root causes of why I'm bleeding, I would start putting band aids everywhere and not really identify where I'm bleeding for. I would just stick on band aids. This is what's happening with the food waste industry or the food waste crisis. There's a lot of band aid solutions where people aren't actually identifying the root cause of why there's food even being wasted. And instead, they're just putting band aids wherever they see blood. So I'd say this chart is just amazing at identifying why and how food waste even happens. It's a lot to take in, but it's got the best chart of the year award. It's amazing. So let's break it down. The first thing that's really important to understand is where does food waste even occur? So we can break it down into a couple of key buckets. The first being on the farm. So this is happening in the field before harvest and after harvest. The second would be the processing chain. So this whole kind of chart outlines the food transportation and production process itself. So you may be familiar with it, you may not be, but after your food is produced on the farm, then it goes into the processing chain. So that's where they filter out the food that's gone bad. That's where they package the food. And then they distribute it. So it goes from these packaging and processing centers to the actual retailers themselves. So then comes the retail section. By retail, this means like grocery stores, it means restaurants, it means delivery facilities, all of these types of things where There's a middleman that's selling it to the consumers. And then households, which is the largest section, if you can see by percentages, households actually make up 51% of food waste. So that's where you and I are wasting food on a day to day basis. The thing with households is specifically, I've looked into the problem and really, as a whole, when I was tackling the food waste problem, I saw that, okay, household seems to be the largest amount of food being wasted. But there's also something interesting about the problem itself, which is it's a very behavioral problem. So when it's a behavioral problem, that means you have to get to every single person and address why they're not being more careful about their food. You have to tell them the impacts. You have to get them to change the way that they treat food and behave about it. And so addressing that problem as one sole person, it's very difficult because that includes a lot of re-education that you need to do. A lot of getting to every single person on this earth and telling them you have to be a lot more careful with your food. And solely that's difficult. But through an avenue like this, when I'm talking to you guys and we're understanding the problem, this is the way to go about it. This is the way to re educate people, where now that you know about it, you can go tell your family, your friends, and they can keep expanding it to their circle of their network. And that's how people start to know more and more about it. So although it may not be something where a technology solution is applied, it's still super interesting and great to happen when you're doing this by yourself, when you're impacting change on a one-to-one, human to human level. So talking about root causes, I like to approach it in this way called first principles. So this is a mental model that a lot of smart people use. And really, it's funny because smart people use it, but also a lot of unsmart people or little kids use it, which is where they keep asking why. So maybe you as a kid did this, maybe you know some little kids who do this, but they ask why about everything. And although it seems very annoying, in a case like this, when we're solving a problem, it actually makes a lot of sense and it helps you get to the root causes of the problem. For example, if the little kid is asking, "Oh, mommy, why are you going to the bank?" And she's like, "To get money." "Why do you need money?" "Well, because I need to buy stuff for you." "Why do you need money to buy stuff?" "Because that's the way our economic value chain works." So, getting really to the deeper level understanding comes with asking why again and again. So when we ask why, there's a lot of different root causes that we can focus on. With the first level, you see that in the US alone, 25 million tons of food were wasted in 2019. This is at the retail level. So I've chosen looking at the whole problem, like we did, the whole problem, and focusing on one specific thing, which is 11% of the food waste is caused at the retail level. So if you ask why again, why is 25 million tons of food waste caused by the retail level? Where you can break it down into four main things, which is goods being spoiled, the sell by dates being passed. So even though the food's still edible, because it says best before a date and it's already past that date, retailers can't sell it. And there's also damaged goods. And then there's also not abiding by product specifications, which means that when say a retailer is getting a new supply of milk, they didn't apply to the specific storage that they need to do, and now their milk has gone bad. So this would be four different ways that we could keep going deeper into why is retail waste even a problem. And then you could go a step deeper, which is looking into maybe something specific like spoiled goods. Why do goods even spoil in the first place? You can understand that there's three main levels to that as well. One would be customer mishandling. So when the customers go and drop the fruit and they put it back and they run away. The second would be employees doing similar things, or they don't handle it properly, or they're lifting cartons and they're moving them around. The third could be damage from the transportation process. So if it's not as safe for them in something like their trucks, it could cause a lot of issues. So really, this is at a surface level something that you can do with all the different pathways that we've looked at. So you would go into something like distribution, and then you would understand, why is there food being wasted at distribution levels? And you would keep asking, why is this causing that amount of waste? And you can keep going down. And this is really an effective method of getting to solve a problem like this. Another thing that's super interesting to me that I actually only recently found out is that, okay, food waste is a huge problem, but you may not realize how big of an impact it's having during this current pandemic. So, with food waste in general, normally it causes about 30 to 40% of the food that we produce, we're wasting it, right? In the time of COVID-19, the food waste that we're producing can go up to 80%. Now, there's a huge amount of the reasons why, and there's also some crazy implications about this that we can go into. So, the first thing being that as people are more and more panicked, there's a lot of panic buying going on. There's a lot of hoarding. People are stocking up on a lot more food than they can possibly eat. Some people aren't even used to produce or like cooking their own food every single day. So, it's very hard for them to be able to monitor how much they need to eat, how much they are eating, how much they're getting something like their food delivery services to bring them food instead of cooking the food that they have in their fridge. There's a lot of food waste going on there. There's also this huge crisis where there's a divide between smaller and larger farmers. So with larger farmers and smaller farmers, normally smaller farmers would be selling to things like schools or institutions, local things, farmers markets. But recently, because of things like schools and institutions shutting down, social distancing being enforced, they don't have the contracts with larger scale retailers. That's how the food is being sold, because the farmers sell to the grocery stores by having contracts with them. And because these smaller scale farms don't have the access to these grocery stores anymore, they're really having a trouble to sell all their food. A lot of them are just replanting their food or throwing it out on the spot because they don't have any way to deliver the food. They don't have the manpower to do this. The bigger farmers, however, are producing more and more food. They're earning more and more money. They kind of have a monopoly over the different food avenues, the different retailers, the grocery stores, all of that. So what's happening is that now these smaller farmers, they don't have a way to sell their food. Their food's being wasted. Well, what happens is that now these farmers, they're not selling their food. That means they're not getting enough profits. Right now, we're not seeing the effects of this because we're still going through it. But their next planting season, when they don't have enough food sales, so they don't even know if they can sell any more food, and they don't have enough money maybe to afford to be able to plant anymore, then there is a huge possibility of a food shortage being caused, especially in agricultural industry based countries. If you think about like India and China, there's a lot of provinces that have extremely agriculture based economies where a lot of the people are farmers. A lot of the people rely on their day to day to be able to make the money from selling their food and then putting food on their own plate. Well, if they're not able to make the money in the first place, now they're stuck in a cycle of they can't afford to put any more food into the ground to grow it for the rest of the people. And what happens then is that if food isn't even being produced, then there's a food shortage that can possibly happen. And so, although we're talking about the impacts of like the coronavirus on a lot of different industries, like the financial industry, like the stock markets, like carbon dioxide emissions and global warming as a whole, we're not really talking about it as a food waste level. And the thing is that a lot of these smaller farmers, they also don't have access to be able to have a platform to talk about this in the first place, because a lot of these farmers are elderly people. They don't really have the access to technology that you and I have via something like this live stream right now. So if they can't even talk about it, if they can't even express their concerns, how are they going to solve it? And so when looking at this problem as a whole, it's so important to understand what's happening with the problem itself, how is it being impacted by our day to day, and really what can we do about it? So solutions, what can you and I even do about it? If we break down the types of solutions that exist, there's really three types, being prevention, which is we're not even having food waste possible in the first place. The second being recovery. So once food is being wasted, suppose I have an excess of food in my house, if I want to, instead of throwing it out, send it to some other food recovery source, maybe donate it to a food bank or a homeless shelter, then that would be at the recovery stage. And then recycling. So if you can recover or use the waste as something like a biofuel, or whether you can use it as compost or for feeding the animals, that would all come in huge usage. But before we even go into the solutions, it is super, super important to understand that the status quo doesn't define what we're capable of doing. Because right now, the problem isn't even being effectively solved. That's why there's still so many mind blowing stats. That's why it's still such a huge problem. And so, although it may seem like it's best to follow in the tracks of how other people are solving the problem right now, it really isn't. It's really, really important, especially for youth like us, to identify the problem and see if this is a problem, then we really need to look at it as a whole and not be biased by the existing solutions, but come up with the best possible solutions with our own creative and outsider spin to it. Because a lot of the time, the people within the industry are very siloed. They're very looking at this is how I do my processes. Maybe if I tweak this small thing, then I could save a small amount. Instead, if we could look at it through the root causes level, looking at if retail waste is causing 11% of the problem and breaking down the whys and understanding the deepest problem possible, then a solution will come almost instantly. And so we can look at it from a lot of different angles, but I think especially important would be the angle of consumer solutions. So, what you and I can do about this problem, because although there are a bunch of solutions that can be done at a more government level or an institution level, there's a lot of things that we can still do at our own level to solve that 51% of food waste being caused by you and I. So, the first thing would just be awareness. Through something like this, we are really learning about the problem, understanding that it is super, super harmful for our world, for our societies, for our environment. And we're bringing awareness so that you, next time you think about wasting food or buying so much food that you know you won't be able to consume, or getting that extra plate at a buffet that you think it looks good, but you might not be able to eat it, you double think. You think twice about whether it really does make sense to do or it's not the best choice and you should be careful about what you're doing. There are also a lot of ways that you can prevent it through things that are available on the internet right now. Like there's this app I saw the other day on the App Store called Food Lime, where they teach you how to repurpose foods into like foods that may be going bad or foods that are at the end of their expiry date, maybe into things that are edible or into things that you can consume right now. And so understanding and being proactive about the situation, that once you know that food waste is a problem, you should be active about what you can do about it. Other things just include being improving your lifestyle, sharing it with the people that you know how to improve on the way that you live your daily lives. So, when it comes to things like buying in bulk, understand that if you have a large family and you can share the amount of food that you have, then that's great. But if you're an only person, you know you won't be able to finish that bag of pineapples, then it just doesn't make sense to buy it. Or it makes sense for you to look out for other organizations that can help you to donate the food, or you wouldn't just buy that much in the first place. So there's a lot of different ways that we can live our daily lives, slightly modifying what we do, but making a huge improvement in the amount of food we're wasting. And really, by sharing this message, by sharing with the people that you know, the people that you love, the extreme impacts of a problem like this, a behavioral problem, you can really impact the amount of people who know about it and the amount of people who do something about it. And then there's a bunch of other things, which are solutions throughout the supply chain. So these are just a couple, which I've broken down by the financial benefit. So by actually posing solutions that have a financial benefit to, say, the farmer or to the retailer, it just incentivizes them or makes people want to solve them even more. So things like improved inventory management, you when you're creating solutions to this problem, you have to break down your biases or things that you may think happened from before and really validate them from talking to different people. So, in my work so far, I've really gotten into the nitty gritty by talking to people who are actively looking into this industry, who are actively trying to solve it for a long time. And what I'm doing is crowdsourcing the knowledge of not only the stuff on the internet, but also by people who are working in all these different parts of solving food waste and bringing it together to be able to come up with something new. So you may think that grocery stores around you have a great way of tracking the amount of food that they have or understanding when they should put certain produce out because it might go bad. But that's actually a huge assumption. And so many grocery stores don't have anything like that in place. You can also look at produce specifications, which is produce that looks kind of ugly or funky. You may not know this, but there are actually huge, huge conditions and regulations set in place for when the retailers or the grocery store people are buying food from the farmers. And this really boils down again to a consumer problem, to us, because we aren't okay with seeing a brown spot on our banana or a dent in our potato. The retailers and the grocery store owners, they know this, and that's why they choose to buy the prettiest produce possible. And that's why a lot of food, they just say, oh, this has too many dents in it, or this has too many holes in it. We just won't buy it. But the thing is, that food is equally as edible as any other food. It's just being wasted because we as consumers are picky. So, some solutions that come with imperfect produce are some grocery store lines are now creating ways for you to buy quote unquote ugly foods. And so with this, you can be aware that this food is just as good as any other. It's food is food. I can still eat it instead of it going to waste. I might as well buy some more food. Farmers are also redistributing ugly food into repurposing it. So if your carrot is really ugly, then they can put it into a pickled carrot. And at that stage, because being it's being pickled, it's going through this different process, the physical appearance of it doesn't really matter anymore. There's also things like donation services. So, at least for me, living in Toronto, Canada, we have quite a few local services that repurpose and donate food. So, whether that's at a consumer level, where if I know that I have a lot of waste, I can give it to the food bank, or at something like a restaurant level, where the restaurants have a lot of extra produce. So what they can do with it is they can partner with any of these organizations. What they do are act as a middleman. So they deliver it to the people in need by connecting the people who have extra food with people who don't have enough food. And by bridging that gap, a lot of people are successfully doing this. And the only problem with this is that there's still a problem of awareness. There's still a problem of people taking that extra step to not want to waste their food. And in order to do that, again, it boils down to us being aware of it. And a final thing would be something like waste tracking and analytics. So if we look into technological solutions for problems that we have in our world, there's also a really important need to understand that if we think about solutions in the way that, oh, yeah, this is the most attractive looking solution, I can apply so many new technologies to it and it just like looks good, but it isn't solving the problem. That is incredibly ineffective and not the way you should be going in. Instead, understanding the problem and seeing, okay, maybe if we don't have a way of tracking the food that we're wasting, using something like analytics softwares would be an interesting approach. So, understanding waste along the supply chain is something that's also a really prominent problem and something that's being tackled by people clearly logging which information about their food being wasted, or doing things like putting it on the blockchain and understanding and having that information unchangeable so that it's very clear, very transparent, and across the supply chain. So, as a whole, food waste is a huge, huge problem. And I hope I've helped you guys to break it down a little bit more, understand it, and really identify and realize that there's so much we can do further to solve this problem. There's so much that you as an individual can do to help tackle that 51%. And there's so much that we can do by just looking online, sharing resources, talking to people that are easily accessible to us, and identifying new ways that we can solve this problem. Thank you. So now I'll just be looking into whether there's any questions. Please do go ahead to ask any questions that you may have. So if there's anything at all that you'd like me to go over, or maybe any other concerns that you may have, or any questions about the process, or something that I really didn't go deeper into, then you can for sure go into that. Okay, so I'm seeing one question. How do you think the current pandemic situation affects the food waste crisis, or does it even affect it? Might be a weird question, but still, that's definitely not a weird question at all. And it's actually, we talked about it already, but it's super, super impactful. And that's actually the current area that I'm trying to look into right now by understanding and bridging the need between farmers and the retailers, the people who need to sell food and the people who have so much excess, and understanding that these farmers actually have very low technical competencies. So they may not be able to really solve the problem on their own, or a lot of them are just in panic mode right now. They aren't really able to create their own solutions. And this is where there's so much manpower still needed, because it's not even being talked about. Then how are people even supposed to know that they're supposed to create solutions to it? How does imperfect foods influence this issue? I think I covered it a little bit, but I'll go over it again. Where um, imperfect foods, because they're ugly, the consumers like us, we don't see them as something that we would want to consume or buy, even though they might still be edible. There's a lot of ways that foods actually become imperfect. So starting at the actual growth, if you pull out a potato and it's just not up to the retailer's standards, then they can reject it, and the farmers don't really have anything to do with it except for throwing it out. Some farmers do have ways to deal with it, like using things like farmers markets, but especially in our current situation, those aren't available for them to use. Otherwise, throughout the supply chain, suppose in transport, food is being kind of ruined or made ugly because of different conditions. Like suppose the temperature of the trucks aren't proper enough, or like they're not adequate for the food to be kept at, so then it can start to spoil much faster, and by the time it gets into stores, the food's browned, or it's like got dents in it. There's also a thing to realize that a lot of the food that's being imported has a pretty short like shelf life after it's pulled out of the ground. So I believe with pineapples it is that once it's like picked and put into the supply chain, there's only like 6 or 7 days that it has until it starts to go bad. So a lot of the time, it already spends like 4 to 5 days in transport going from halfway across the world to the other half of the world. So once it actually hits the shelves, it only has a couple of days. And if people don't use that produce, then it'll start to go bad. How do you personally implement these individual solutions in my life? So I've really been trying to be mindful about the amount of food I waste. I definitely have been using a lot more of the resources where it tells me how to actively like work on and change the amount of food that I'm using and reducing it. So a lot of things like meal prepping or having the precise amount of food that I'm going to eat ready for me to eat and trying not to let things go bad. That's what I've also been doing. Another really important thing is actually, and a really impactful thing that people have been trying to come up with solutions for is best before dates. So, although I didn't touch on it over here, it's actually hugely economically incentivized. But the thing is that there is no governmental organization or regulation for best before dates on food. So, I'm not sure if you guys are aware of this, but actually, best before dates are not indicative of the food being unedible. It's just showing that once the best before date is reached, then you can't go up to the people who are selling it to you and complain that it's not its most fresh quality. That means that if you have a bag of chips and the best before date was yesterday, you can still eat it. There's nothing that'll happen wrong with you. So like, although I'm not telling you to eat food that's been expired for like 15 years, just being aware that if the food quality is the only thing that's decreased and it's not actually physically gone bad, there aren't as many negative implications of just eating the food. So there's only a couple of actual foods that can go bad, like a couple of like milks and like baby formula, I believe. Like if you're talking about packaged foods, those are the only things that can go actually like expire. So I'd encourage you guys to like search that up and to see which foods that are actually a part of your diet that can go bad and the other foods that maybe you'd be throwing out, like packaged foods that aren't actually as bad as you'd need them to like just discard them completely. Um At what level should major change start, though? If there's an improvement at the process line, there will be more food in retail, thus more things to mishandle. I think it's when really approaching this problem, there's not any like one place that you would end up starting at, anyways, considering there are solutions. There are solutions being implemented at all the levels, anyways. When you're looking at the problem itself, it's really important for like if you're trying to solve the problem for you to identify like what's in the scope of your knowledge, what is there resources available to solve for, what do you think would be impactful, and then work towards that. With major change starting, like it honestly needs to start at all of the parts, and since not any one person would be starting the change, it would be a group of people, multiple people throughout the different chains, then it's like all the change needs to happen like ASAP. So it's as these parts start to improve, then the other parts will also simultaneously improve. Do you know about containering? I'm not sure what you mean exactly. If you could specify, then that would be great. Other questions? So I'm just getting a little bit of a delay in seeing all the questions, but I'll start to address them as any more come in. Are there sources of planned or not food loss that can be used for other industries? For example, plant leather made from certain husks for textile and clothing industry. Yeah, this is a huge way that we can repurpose foods. So, like I mentioned with things like pickling or like things going into stews, The same thing applies with food being able to be put into different industries. So yeah, repurposing plants for foods and other like methods in different industries that can be more beneficial, like that's definitely a really impactful thing that's already happening. But there's also like a couple of barriers to it, like accessibility and um, when like how quickly the people in the other industries can get the food. So when it's still in a usable state, then it's great. And if there are middlemen in place that can deliver it from one place to another, then that's great. But a lot of the times, like farmers don't have awareness about this, or the key other players in industries don't have access to farmers nearby. So they don't really connect it. Another way, I guess, on that note would be like farmers using like ugly foods or imperfect foods into things like animal produce or animal feed. So, like a lot of the pigs, the cows that they have on the farm, they can just feed them the mush of the unused foods. However, that's not the best way. It's again like a band aid solution. It's not identifying the root cause and solving it. It's more of, I have this extra food, I'll just give it to them. But then it's also very like, you have to think about it from different perspectives. So that's still very negative for the people, like the farmers themselves, because they're still at a loss. So if like when looking at this website specifically, the economic incentive of repurposing food in that way is actually almost negative for the farmers, in the sense that they're still losing money every time they do something like that. Would you say that certain countries carry more responsibility for addressing the food crisis, developing versus developed countries? I definitely think that there are some countries that have a lot more capabilities to do things than others do, just because they have the infrastructure in place for basic things. So if like a way I like to think about it is that if people don't even have like basic needs like water or like hospitals, right? Food waste is kind of like a far away thing for them, even though it'd be very like impactful for them to solve the problem. It's still like they don't have as much infrastructure set in place for food waste itself. Like when we identified developing versus developed countries, where the waste is happening, with developed countries, a lot of the waste was happening at the consumer level. And so accountability on that front would be really important and very necessary. All this talking has got me hoarse. Yeah. And then just in general with like developed countries, it's so much of the problem is it's frustrating really, because so much of the problem is being caused by the consumer just being like overly comfortable with the amount of food they have and just not grateful or mindful of what they should be doing with it. So it's like a very consumer oriented problem. But then there's also things like the government, where the government doesn't have things like best before date regulation practices in place, or like with farmers, it's very, very siloed. So like the farmers don't really have a regulatory board to see like, or the retailers really, in fact, they don't have like any governing body to tell them, hey, you can't just reject every single food that you don't like, or hey, if you made a deal with a farmer, you have to follow through with that and buy all their food. If we're talking about keeping people accountable, it's like a lot of the food waste crisis is still a problem because people keep pointing fingers. It's like, it's on you. You should be solving this problem first, or you really need to be taking more responsibility. As a whole, everyone needs to be taking responsibility. For the people who can take more, it would be people like the retailers who are in a lot of the power. It's not really apparent at a surface level, but farmers actually have some of the least like control over what's being sold, because the retailers have the manpower. They have the power to say, "Oh yeah, we want like this distributor, we want this type of packaging, we want this amount," and the farmers kind of have to like follow along, and they don't really have the deciding power in that sense. So, but then the thing is, like, if we want to have accountability, what is the economic incentive for retailers? one of the people who I was talking to who's been solving or working on the food waste crisis for so long told me that really bringing accountability to retailers is so hard because they don't have any economic incentive to do it. It's making them very less money if we just tell them, oh, you should just be nice and um, like continue or like change your practices, right? Instead, what could be done and what's interesting to see is that where is it economically incentivized for them to change? So if you look at a problem like fresh foods in grocery stores, so I'm not sure how common it is for wherever you guys are, but here there are some stores with like delis in them where the food that's maybe going bad, like if you have some breads that are close to expiration date, or just in general, like food from the grocery store, is used in the fresh food aisle. So they have like different types of sandwiches or salads, all these types of things. And that's actually, at least in Canada, one of the largest pain points and loss of profits for grocery stores. And so if we can track how much time it's going to take for that food to go bad or to be able to monitor and like predict how much food you need to produce, then a lot of that food that's being made fresh wouldn't have to go to waste. And so in that sense, it would be that's like another problem area that would make sense for the retailers to focus on because they're losing so much of their profits on it, while it would still be like reducing food waste as a whole. And talking about picking food out of the supermarket trash containers, there is food which is still edible, and therefore many people are doing this. They do this instead of buying new perfect food. Yeah, it's things like dumpster diving. Although they like that does happen, I'm not sure how commonly it happens here, but it's again like not a solution to the problem per se because like you're not really monitoring how much people are like able to repurpose the food and like again with there's like a lot of really harmful regulations and going back to the problem of like who should be held accountable, who should be creating a lot of the change. There are some regulations where if grocery stores get returns on fresh foods, I know a lot of this happens like very commonly here. They can't like donate the food; they just have to throw it out. So even if you buy like a bunch of I don't know like fresh lettuce and you leave the store, but you realize you need like 2 bags less of lettuce, and you come back and return it, they're obligated to throw it out. So a lot of like food repurposers and redirectors of food waste are good at like solving this, but it's not super common. And so although like maybe people once the food's thrown out, like since they're not legally allowed to give it to other like people who are homeless or people who need the food, like people may go into the thrown out food and instead of buying new food, they may do it, but it's like not a super feasible solution. Yeah. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. And definitely, if you have like any questions at all, or if you just want to chat, I love to meet new people. You can email me, visit my personal website, or tweet at me. And love to stay in touch. Thank you so much for tuning in. And please do as much as you can to solve the food waste crisis on your own. Thanks.